Make sure, if you're not sure about whether you have enough milk, to consult like a lactation specialist, and not just some random people on the internet like me. Hi there, this is Roberta from Dama Inspired Living, and today I would like to talk about the challenges of breastfeeding and the kind of things that I wish people would have told me before I started my breastfeeding journey. Welcome. If you're here, I'm guessing you're either pregnant, or you're thinking of being pregnant, or you're thinking of breastfeeding. And wow, I'm so excited for your breastfeeding journey to commence. And I'm also here to tell you the ups and the downs of breastfeeding, so you kind of know what to expect out of breastfeeding. Or certainly my experiences with breastfeeding. I kind of want to break this down into the amazing positive parts of breastfeeding, and then the challenges of breastfeeding that maybe people are not really talking about as much. So breastfeeding is beautiful. It's absolutely amazing, and if you've had a really positive experience at birth, and that can be anything that feels positive for you, it doesn't have to look in any certain way, then breastfeeding is a beautiful natural progression to the birth. And I totally respect if someone doesn't want to breastfeed. Based on my research, if you have a kind of like a physiological natural birth, there's a strong instinctive sense of wanting to breastfeed, and also your baby wants to come to your boob, so they're kind of like looking for your boob. And yeah, if you have that kind of really strong feeling to want to breastfeed, that is quite normal in terms of your biological senses. And also I want to say that, you know, if you want to breastfeed, or you wanted to breastfeed and you weren't able to, I also see you, because it's, yeah, breastfeeding is not so as easy as one might expect, especially the first week of breastfeeding, but that will come into the challenges. I'll talk about that in a moment. But the beauties of breastfeeding is incredibly connecting. It helps with postpartum depression hugely. It releases oxytocin in your body. It's like kind of like the feel-good hormone. So when you're really struggling, especially with a newborn, and things are difficult, when you're breastfeeding, it actually really helps you tap into that love and tap into that feeling of why you're doing this, and that just sense of awe and amazement of your child and of this connection that you have. Breastfeeding really helps with building your connection with your baby. And I'm not saying that if you're not breastfeeding you cannot have a connection. Obviously that would be silly. But I noticed that when I was breastfeeding my daughter or my son, I definitely connect with them much more in a much deeper way. And also it's a moment for you to enjoy just the two of you without any kind of distractions. So that's a beauty. Another beauty about breastfeeding is that your child really sort of recognizes you and wants to be close to you, because they're getting that milk from you. And I feel like breastfeeding is a bit of a beautiful representation of kind of like unconditional love. And I'm not saying if you're not breastfeeding you don't unconditional love your child. It feels like that unconditional love is flowing through you, like through your boobs. And it's absolutely wonderful. I want to start with this because I think it's really important to understand how amazing breastfeeding is before I go into the challenges, because it is also challenging. And yeah, just to keep you going if you are finding it difficult. The challenges of breastfeeding that I wish people would have told me about. Number one is that it's not so easy, because I don't know why I thought this, but before I gave birth, I was like, oh, I'm definitely going to breastfeed, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be so difficult. What can be so difficult about it, right? Like, it's just a biological thing, you're breastfeeding, whatever. And actually the reason that breastfeeding is difficult is something that you might not think of or expect. Certainly I didn't think of it. And that is that when you've given birth, usually at the time of giving birth, you feel extremely tired, exhausted, sore, though you're on a high of just, you know, having given birth. From all the hormones in your body, you're on the high, but at the same time you're extremely tired, you're sore, you are in pain, you've had maybe you know, depending on how long your labor was, for some people labor can be 36 hours. My labor was only 6.5 hours with my daughter, with my first child, and even then I was exhausted and I was like, oh my god. So that's part of the reason. Like, imagine not having slept for 2 hours, having run like a half marathon and being really tired, and then someone says to you, oh, here's a baby, good luck, try to feed them. So you're incredibly tired in the beginning, and also your baby is also maybe a bit tired or wired from the birth, or maybe they had a birth that was quite a, you know, it's quite a shocking experience for a baby, and they're only learning how to breathe and swallow and suck at the same time. So they're figuring it out, you're figuring it out, and then things come in your mind like, am I doing this right? You know, maybe you feel a bit worried, is my baby getting enough milk, and all of that kind of stuff. So the reason it's difficult is because what precedes the breastfeeding. I would like to also say here that if you don't have a good postpartum support plan, which is so incredibly important, please, if you don't have one, check out this video and make sure that you organize it for yourself. If you don't have that, then you won't have enough time and space to be able to dedicate all of that time to your baby and your breastfeeding journey. And the first week, I would say, is definitely just about like establishing your breastfeeding, right? The first few days, first week, I would say, is really important in establishing the breastfeeding. If you're maybe already at home and you have like dishes to do and food to make and this to do and that to do, it's going to be incredibly stressful. So that's definitely one thing I would recommend, is to have that sorted out so you can really focus on the breastfeeding for the first week. The second thing I wish people told me was that breastfeeding is not supposed to be painful. There is some level of discomfort with breastfeeding, but it is not supposed to be painful. I would say that once your baby latches onto your breast, after the first, I don't know, maybe like 30 seconds, when maybe it's a bit like, oh my god, it feels weird and it does feel a little bit like maybe not so comfortable. After that, it should feel comfortable, and it shouldn't feel painful. If there is pain, this is indication of one of two things. A, your baby is not latched on properly, or B, you might have some like breast infection like mastitis. In the first case, if your baby is not latched on properly, this could be due to, again, I think two things. A is bad positioning, but your baby is not positioned well, and so they cannot latch on properly. And B, they might have a tongue tie. And again, in the first case, if they're not positioned properly, I remember with my first daughter, I was kind of shown like how to get her on the boob. But with my second child, with my son, I actually just followed the another method, which is just you kind of like lean back and you put your baby on you, and you just, it's like you flow with your baby and you just allow your baby to kind of move themselves onto your boob and latch on. You're not forcing their head, you're not doing anything, you're allowing them to naturally do it. And that has really been something that has worked for me really well. And especially if you feel really tense or your breasts are sore, it's a nice thing to do in a warm bath with someone else's supervision, that you're in the bath with a baby, obviously to make sure that baby's face is clear of water and your boob is clear of water, and you just go back and you allow the baby to kind of just like get themselves on the boob. That has really, really helped in terms of positioning. The second thing that I mentioned is the tongue tie. And with the tongue tie, what I find really important is to make sure that you see it with a specialist, right? If your baby has tongue tie, it might not be completely obvious that they have a tongue tie. It might be like a posterior tongue tie, which is like in the back. And also sometimes when the tongue tie is in the front, it might not mean that they have to have it snipped, but it's definitely good to see a tongue tie specialist. Both my daughter and my son had a tongue tie. Luna had a posterior one, and Mate, my son, had a one in the front, and neither of them had a tongue tie. But it definitely made the journey a bit more challenging for me, and I didn't know, especially with my daughter, I was like, why is she not getting enough milk? And it was because of her tongue tie. She was still getting enough milk, she was growing, but she was like in the lower percentile of growth for her age. I would appreciate it if you subscribe, to comment in the comments below to say I subscribed, and then I'll respond to you and we can be friends. I said that it would be hard. The second it's not supposed to be painful, and kind of explained why. If it's painful, just going back to that, if it's painful, you gotta stop. You gotta take your baby off your boob. I know it's difficult because your baby might be screaming and you might feel quite stressed out from this, and that's a biological response to your baby crying. When your baby cries, you feel stressed out. So it's hard to be like, oh, the baby's on my boob, now I have to take them off. But trust me, that's the best thing that you can do, because if you leave them on, your boob is going to get more sore and it'll be harder for you to feed your baby, in the future. And also, they're not getting enough milk if they're not latched on properly. So bear that in mind. And also be kind with yourself, because, okay, number 3, be kind with yourself, because this is a journey for you and for your baby, and it's a learning process, just like everything. It's not like you're going to know straight away, or that your baby's going to know straight away. You might be figuring it out, as I said, for the first few days, and that's totally fine. Your baby doesn't need a huge amount of milk in the first few days, right? They need a tablespoon, maybe even less, for the first 1 or 2 days, and kind of even beyond. So you don't need to be mega stressed out, like they're not getting loads of milk, because that's fine. As long as they're getting some milk, you're good to learn this process. Obviously, make sure that you're monitoring your baby's amount of nappies, and that they have pees, and so on. Number 4, this is also to do with breastfeeding, but it's kind of like a weird way of looking at it. Is about your baby's poop. So both Luna and Matti, they were babies that didn't poo. You know how the poo is supposed to go, well, if you're pregnant or if you have a newborn, you know this, but your baby's poo is supposed to go from this meconium, quite dark, thick, to this kind of like brownie, light orangey brownie color, like mustard color, and they're supposed to be pooping quite regularly. But in my experience with both of my kids, they didn't really, that shift didn't really happen for a few days, 3 or 4 days, and maybe even longer. And I had the midwives monitor them, and they were totally fine. So just don't get stressed out about these things, but just make sure that you check in with your midwife. And as long as they're having pee nappies, and your midwife is yeah, they're fine, then it's okay. Okay. Number 5, this is if you're planning to tandem feed. Breastfeeding aversion is real, okay? This is your second child and you're still breastfeeding your first child. Don't be hard on yourself if you suddenly don't want to feed your first child, because it's normal for your body to start to not want your older child to feed and feeling like, don't touch me. And I know it can be quite challenging, because this beautiful experience that you had with your child of breastfeeding them, and suddenly it turns into this experience where you're like, you don't want them to touch you. And just make sure that you grieve this experience shifting, and to be gentle with yourself. Another thing I would recommend is to go to support groups that understand and support breastfeeding aversion, if that's what's happening for you. Number 6, it's a long list. This is something I wish I knew. If you're exclusively breastfeeding and you're not pumping, which is what I was doing, so this, I guess this is relevant to you if you're not planning on pumping, and if you're planning on exclusively breastfeeding, or at least staying with your baby for your maternity leave, which in the UK is 9 months. In other countries, like in Europe, it's maybe 2 years, a year. I know in the US it's crazy, 6 weeks or whatever. That's really crazy. But if you're planning on exclusively breastfeeding, then just be prepared to the fact that you will be glued to your child for the first 6 months pretty consistently. And you won't have very long stretches of time to be on your own. And when I mean long stretches of time, I mean an hour or 2 hours, maybe max 2 hours while they're napping. Someone takes them while they're napping. You will not have a lot of alone time, and it will be pretty full on. And I think this is important to realize, because it will change after 6 months, but when you're in it, when you're in the first few months, you're just like, oh my gosh, I really need 4 hours to myself, because this is just non-stop, and it's also non-stop through the night, especially the first four months until the circadian rhythm kicks in. So just just know that if you're doing that, if you're exclusively breastfeeding, not pumping, it will be challenging for the first 6 months, and then it will ease off. And make sure that you have things in place where you are supported, where people can help you take your baby while they're napping, so you do have that time for yourself. I think that's really, really important, and something that I wish I would have known a little bit before I gave birth, that it's going to ease, and just to have that expectation of what it's going to be like to breastfeed. Your evenings will be a complete write-off. Like, this was a big thing about kids in general, but when you have small kids, your evenings are complete write-off. In order for your child, even when they get older, in order for them to sleep well, you have to have a very consistent routine in the evenings, like food, bath time, bed. And if you breastfeed your child, you're likely going to breastfeed them to bed. Unless of course you choose the cry it out method, which is, you can choose that. That was not the route I was taking, and I suspect maybe if you're watching this, maybe that's not what you want either. You want to make sure that your baby feels comforted when they're falling asleep and not left on their own. And so you might spend a lot of time breastfeeding your child to sleep, especially if you're co-sleeping with them or bed sharing, which is what I was doing. So your evenings are pretty much a write-off for a while, maybe longer than 6 months. So prepare for that. Also, I'm saying write-off, you will get to spend all that time with your baby. Even though it's beautiful and you appreciate it and it's like a magical, it can sometimes feel a bit suffocating, and that's okay. It's okay to admit that maybe it's a bit too much. Yeah, maybe just have that in mind. Or if you're like, oh, that sounds like too intense for me, then make sure that you have plans and provisions for people to help out in that kind of evening setting. Yes, your breasts are going to be massive and they're going to become saggy. And I love my boobs. I am so grateful for my breasts, for feeding my kids, and for providing this nourishment for them. But at the same time, the reality is that my boobs are not like tiny perky like they were before I was pregnant. And that's totally fine, but it's a reality, so something to expect. One more thing to expect is that people will keep asking you whether you have enough milk. Especially if you're like from a European country, like my grandmother and my mom, like, do you have enough milk? And I'm like, sure, why wouldn't I have enough milk? And I guess there has been this kind of myth that, oh, the child is not getting enough milk, so maybe stop feeding them. But the reality is, the more you breastfeed, the more milk you'll have, which means that the more you can nourish your child. So if you want to keep up your breastfeeding, especially the first few weeks are really important, and the first maybe few months, then you want to make sure that you're breastfeeding regularly, on demand, and making sure that you're doing that. And with doing that, you will have more milk. Make sure, if you're not sure about whether you have enough milk, to consult like a lactation specialist, and not just some random people on the internet like me. Because you want to make sure that your baby is getting enough milk, and you also want to make sure that you have the right strategy for your baby. Yeah. And also trust your intuition. But other than everything I've just said just now, breastfeeding is an amazing journey, and it'll be really, really worth it. And you're doing such a good thing for your child. Every day of breastfeeding is helping them with their immune system, with their gut biome. Even if you just breastfeed for one day, it's better than not breastfeeding at all. So yeah. And just to say, there's no judgment towards people who don't breastfeed or choose not to breastfeed or can't breastfeed. Breastfeeding is difficult. Alright, well, thank you very much for watching this video. If you made it all the way to the end, then well done to you. And if you liked it, please like it and hit subscribe. I would appreciate it if you subscribe, to comment in the comments below to say I subscribed, and then I'll respond to you and we can be friends. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.